All right. Hello, everyone. I would like to wish you a good afternoon and thank you all for joining us for the third and final in our virtual SALT conference series with Evan Abramson, Principal of Landscape Interactions, and his presentation, Beyond Pollinator-Friendly, Designing Landscapes and Corridors to Support Regional Biodiversity. I hope you were able to join us for the first two presentations, the role of riparian buffers and watersheds, and your local landscape, and managing critical habitats at the nearing natural area preserve. If not, please note that the recordings are available through Zoom for just 2 weeks. In my past introductions, I spoke about the origins of SALT, the Smaller American Lawns Today movement, and Connecticut College professor William Nearing, who conceived of SALT as an initiative to garden using environmentally sound practices that are in harmony with nature. The first two presentations looked at the importance of living landscapes, and I think that's a great connection to today's presentation. We see so many pressures of development and the obsession with lawns in America, which have led to tremendous habitat loss for birds and insects that need native plants to survive. It won't be easy to change the landscape of America, but I think with dedicated gardeners, such as everyone who's joining us today, and experts such as Evan, we will get there. I do have hope, and I am optimistic for these changes for the future. Before I introduce Evan, I just briefly want to mention some of the many resources available through the Arboretum. Our website, arboretum.concall.edu, has a tremendous number of resources, including a section on ecological landscaping, where we share many of the concepts of planting native plants, understanding environmental conditions, removing invasives, lawn reduction, as well as regional sources for purchasing native plants, a few good books for identification and how-tos. In the new year, we will be reintroducing our public programs with workshops and lectures. And in the spring, we will again have guided tours of our native plant collection and Caroline Black Garden. We hope you can take advantage of some of these, and feel free to be in touch with us if you have any questions about these presentations or pretty much anything to do with native plants. We are always happy to hear from you. It looks like everyone has got their videos off and is on mute during the presentation. We will encourage questions during the presentation to be submitted through the chat feature. Following Evan's presentation, we will have time for questions and answers, and you're welcome to turn on your video and unmute yourself during that time. We do miss the in-person gathering of SALT, where we're able to say hello to each other and share ideas. So hopefully we will again be able to do that next year. But now it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Evan Abramson is a designer and planner on a mission to rebuild biologically diverse ecosystems through pollinator-plant interactions. As principal of Landscape Interactions, he works closely with project partners from nonprofit, private, and public sectors on efforts ranging from regional corridors to site-specific designs. In 2020, Landscape Interactions was responsible for designing over 100 acres of habitat installed in the Northeast, specifically targeting at-risk bee and butterfly species for each project location. Drawing on his diverse experience as a farmer, community organizer, documentary filmmaker, and photojournalist, Evan holds a Master of Science in Ecological Design from the Conway School of Landscape Architecture, certificates in Permaculture Design and Biodynamic Gardening, and is the author of the Lincoln and Great Barrington Pollinator Action Plans. It is my pleasure to now introduce Evan.
Thank you, Maggie, and thank you all for attending. Today's talk is Beyond Pollinator-Friendly. The idea here is to talk about what we do when we make decisions about planting on a landscape or a restoration site, and how plant selection influences the resilience and the biodiversity of a landscape at the species level. So I'd like to start out by talking about giving a little context of why this work is so crucial today. Right now, we're living in the age of the Anthropocene. It's a new geological epoch which has been declared, and it's defined by a striking acceleration of carbon dioxide emissions and sea level rise, as well as the global mass extinction of species and transformation of land by development. And currently, as many as 30 to 50% of all species on the planet are heading toward extinction by the middle of this century. It's the web of life on Earth that is at risk at the moment. What this essentially implies is that we're facing a potential collapse of nature. 1 million species are threatened with extinction globally, including over half of the native bee species in North America. Insects are essential for all ecosystems, not only as pollinators, but also as food for other creatures at other trophic levels and recyclers of nutrients. And at the current rate of decline, insects could literally vanish within a century. Habitat loss is understood to be the main reason why, as well as widespread pesticide use, especially the introduction of neonicotinoids in the last 20 years. And to quote one scientist from one of the peer-reviewed journal articles that are listed here at the bottom, we're sleepwalking towards the edge of a cliff. What this is looking like in North America is an ecological crisis, unfortunately. And you can see this movement of species loss across trophic levels when you compare the insect crisis to the bird crisis. North America has lost 3 billion birds since 1970, which is over 1 in 4 birds in the past 50 years. And again, habitat loss is the most direct cause. So the same reasons why we're losing insects and pollinators are the same reasons why we're losing birds and wildlife at other levels. According to the UN's Convention on Biological Diversity, there's 5 main threats to global biodiversity. Number 1, the biggest threat is changes in land and sea use, basically humans converting wild areas or conserved areas into something human focused, such as large industrial farms, cities, towns, highways, mining. The second is exploitation of natural resources, again, mining, deforestation, those kinds of activities, which is then followed third by climate change. So in fact, land use and human use of resources are bigger threats to biodiversity than climate change, regardless of what some of that may imply. Pollution is then next, followed by invasive species. And interestingly enough, since the 17th century, invasive species have contributed to 40% of all known animal extinctions. Now, granted, that is globally, and that includes some very unique ecological communities on islands, for example, but still, I think it's an interesting number to consider. At the moment, over a third of the world's land surface and nearly 75% of freshwater resources are devoted to crop or livestock production. So we really need to consider how we're using the earth if we wish to continue to have nature. And survive, have clean air, clean water, and those other ecosystem services that natural ecosystems provide us. And since 1992, urban areas have more than doubled. Oftentimes wetlands and scrublands and woodlands are the result of that development being destroyed. Warmer temperatures are also impacting the timing of blooming time for flowers and the emergence of pollinators. So as climate change continues, it does cause these plant-pollinator interactions to go out of sync. But really, to understand the climate crisis and to understand the biodiversity crisis, you really have to solve both, or you can't solve either of them. These are not issues that can be solved independently of one another. According to the UN, again, and the two studies that are listed here at the bottom, both are peer-reviewed, it's not really about climate change impacting or causing biodiversity loss. In fact, the loss of biodiversity is deepening the climate crisis. Connected, diverse, and extensive ecosystems stabilize the climate, and they actually help areas to respond better to disturbances that climate change brings, such as flooding, wildfires, extreme drought, extreme rainfall, and other issues like that. And so really, rather than looking at biodiversity as a victim of climate change, it should be seen as a key ally in dealing with climate change. Grasslands follow forest as one of the most important carbon sinks on the planet. And currently, 20% of global carbon stocks and a third of the world's land-based carbon are held in grasslands, which includes natural meadow communities and prairies. Looking at the Midwest in particular, we've really lost a lot of those grassland ecosystems because of monocultures of corn and soybeans, which, to be honest, are usually these days not even grown for human consumption. So we have to ask ourselves, to what end are we growing these things? US agriculture accounts for over 10% of the USA's total emissions of carbon. And a 2019 study found that tillage for cropland was putting as much carbon in the air annually as 31 million cars. Another study found that conserving grasslands in the US could prevent almost 3 times as much carbon emission as conserving forests. That's super interesting because so much of the carbon conversation is centered around forests, but in fact, grasslands hold a lot of carbon. And while in the Amazon, not to minimize the destruction of the Amazon, but interestingly, only 20% of grasslands in the Amazon have been lost compared to half of temperate grasslands worldwide, which includes Northern and Central Europe and the United States and Canada. A study from California found that grasslands and rangelands are actually more resilient carbon sinks than forests in a 21st century scenario in California where you have so many wildfires, because grasslands sequester most of their carbon underground. You can see here in this photograph, which is of Indian grass, a native warm season bunching grass that we also have in the Northeast, that it's got about 14 feet of root. And when you burn grasslands, because they are naturally evolved to be disturbed through fire and occasional grazing, the carbon stays underground. It doesn't go up into the atmosphere like it does when forests go up in flames. So essentially, they're finding in places like California and out west, where there's so many wildfires, that it might make more sense to convert more landscapes to grasslands and rangelands rather than trying to plant them back as forests. This here is a diagram of the root systems of various native, some northeastern, some midwestern prairie species. And I just like to compare here. So on the left, you have Kentucky bluegrass, which is your typical turf or lawn grass. And you can see here that the root depth is about 2 inches. Now here towards the middle is heath aster, which is one of our native asters in the Northeast. And it's got a root depth of about 8.5 feet. Over here is switchgrass, going down to nearly 12 feet root depth. And then on the right, little blue stem, which is somewhere between 6 and 8 feet. So really, the function of native grasses, sedges, and flowers and shrubs is really phenomenal as far as not only carbon sequestration, but also the ability to provide nutrient flow through the soil and subsoil to allow water to move from surface level soil down to the deeper areas. So having these different plants coexisting in a landscape along with, trees and shrubs and other structural elements of a woodland or a meadow landscape will actually help they all help each other to obtain more water, more nutrients, and to move organisms through the soil at various levels. Whereas on the left, you can see what our turf grass is really doing, not much more than keeping the dirt covered. But at the same time, the depth of roots of these plants is not necessarily indicative of where they pull water from. So over here on the right is a diagram, and you can see here that grasses, while they may have root depths that go almost as deep as shrubs, in fact, they tend to pull water from the first 30 inches of soil or less. And flowers are just a little bit past that, whereas shrubs obtain water from any depth, but most get it from 18 inches minimum down to as deep as 8 or 10 feet. So just imagine the implications of adding shrubs to a landscape as far as the ability to help other plants obtain what they need to survive and thrive, and at the same time to hold that soil in place in the event that there is some sort of a disturbance. Really here, the subject of today's talk, while I am looking at pollinator-friendly landscapes and the differences in what you plant impacting which pollinators, it's really essentially the idea being to recreate nature or to design biodiversity. I see farms, conservation lands, suburban, urban greenways, and rural areas as really our best opportunities for expanding regional biodiversity, climate resilience, ecological health, and food security through the implementation of functionally diverse native pollination systems, which are communities of plants and pollinators that interact with each other. Because what happens at the pollination scale has implications and repercussions all the way through the food web to primary, secondary, and tertiary consumers, and all the way up to humans. Why are pollinators so essential, and why does it matter which pollinators we attract and sustain on a landscape? Well, in the Northeast, pollinators are primarily insects that fertilize plants, producing seeds and fruit. They're responsible for assisting over 80% of the world's flowering plants in reproduction. So without those pollinators, these plants would not be able to exist. In Massachusetts, bees alone pollinate nearly half of the food crops and 1/3 of the food grown in the US. And they're vital, pollinators as a whole are vital to creating and maintaining habitats and ecosystems that most animals, including birds and humans, rely upon for food and shelter. Some plants depend upon a particular family or genus of pollinators to ensure their reproduction, and approximately 15% of northeastern native bee species are considered to be pollen specialists at the family or genus level, meaning that if they don't find a particular family or genus of plants, they will not be able to survive and to feed their eggs and young. So what are the needs of a bee in a landscape? When we're looking at creating a regional corridor or a landscape, we're really trying to design in the eyes of a bee. In the US, we've got 4,000 native bee species, and over 400 of them live in the Northeast. Native bees do the vast majority of pollination. In a global study looking at 40 different food crops across 600 independent fields on every continent, wild pollinators were twice as effective as honeybees in producing seeds and fruit. So I really challenge people that are raising honeybees or farmers that are depending upon honeybees for crop pollination to really ask themselves, why honeybees? Why not create more natural habitat for wild pollinators? Clearly, they are more robust at food crop pollination, and they're also essential for ecosystem function. The average foraging range of a native bee from its nest is not very far, only between 200 and 1,800 feet on average, and 70% of native bee species nest underground. Most are solitary, so with the exception of bumblebees, almost all native bee species are solitary, meaning that females lay their eggs and raise them alone until they're ready to leave the nest. And other examples of habitat include bare ground, soft pith twigs like elderberry and Joe pyeweed, abandoned rodent burrows, and dead trees and snags. This here is a diagram of one of our project areas in Lincoln, Massachusetts. And what we did was we mapped out the average foraging range of 3 different types of native bee species, small, medium, and large. And the average distance, not the maximum distance, but the average distance that they would go from their nest. And so you can see here that bumblebees really provide the most opportunities for habitat connectivity between different sites, but the more connected the landscape, the more sites that have habitat, as in this case, here are 6 sites in Lincoln that all have our plant recommendations installed. You can see the more that these sites pop up, the more interconnected the landscape and the more of an opportunity for a true corridor to be formed. Other significant pollinators besides bees include everything from the ruby-throated hummingbird, Aphrodite fritillary, which is an example of a butterfly of conservation concern in Massachusetts and most likely in neighboring states as well. The monarch butterfly, not at risk in the Northeast, but 81% population decline globally, so certainly at risk globally. And the Dion skipper would be another example of a sedge-based butterfly, which is threatened in Massachusetts. It depends upon sedge wetlands, marshes, and swamps to survive and to exist. So depending upon the landscape, the site, what's growing there, what exists there, and where it's located geographically, we would target different pollinators for the restoration and the design work. You're not going to expect to attract a Dion skipper to your site if it's a very well-drained upland field with no wetlands within close proximity. At the same time, you wouldn't be able to target an Aphrodite fritillary if you didn't have violets, because violets are their only host plant. And with the monarch, as we all know, it's milkweed. Most of us are probably familiar with the concept of colony collapse disorder. Between 1980 and 2005, the number of honeybee colonies in the United States halved from 4.5 million to 2.25 million. And again, the most prevalent reasons for this were habitat loss, pesticides, and climate change. So you can see the pressures affecting honeybees are not that different from those affecting native bees. And as a whole, biodiversity loss. So we kind of know what we need to do if we want to save these species. But since 2005, honeybee populations in the US have actually been not only stable, but increasing. And that's because there's been so much funding and research and just essentially money put into restoring honeybee colonies in the US, a lot of it through the Farm Bill and the NRCS and the USDA. At the same time, wild bees in the United States, just between 2010 and 2015, in abundance, dropped 23% in just 5 years. And in this map here, you can see that areas that are yellow are the areas in the United States that have the lowest wild bee abundance. At the same time, we should also consider that in New England, 22% of native plants are rare, in decline, endangered, or extinct. I think it's interesting that we're really facing these numbers that are so similar. Here is a map of the estimated use just in agriculture of one type of neonicotinoid pesticide in 2014. And you can see here areas in darker red are the areas with the highest estimated use of this type of pesticide. They're essentially the same areas as those that have the lowest wild bee abundance. And it tends to be the areas with the largest amount of farmland and the areas that are the most developed, those closer to the coasts and urban centers. Looking at the impacts of honeybees on native bees, here is just a small selection of peer-reviewed journals that have addressed or researched the subject, and I've pulled a few quotes to consider. Conserving honeybees does not help wildlife. Local bumblebee decline linked to the recovery of honeybees. A 40 hive apiary residing on wildlands for 3 months collects the pollen equivalent of 4 million wild bees. So every time you've got a hive, you're putting approximately 100,000 native bees out of production as far as finding pollen. So raising honeybees to save the pollinators is essentially like raising chickens to save the birds. It's just not going to work. It doesn't work. They're totally different things. What we have to think about we have to think about honeybees in a different way. Honeybees are like livestock. Wild bees are like wildlife. Raising livestock does not help wildlife. And at the same time, raising honeybees does not help pollinators in decline, which are wild pollinators, native pollinators. Honeybees are not in decline. We don't need to save them. So beyond pollinator-friendly, most efforts to restore pollination systems or most projects creating pollinator habitat have focused on increasing the numbers of a few bee or butterfly species, oftentimes based on their crop pollination abilities or in general, the fact that they are pollinators rather than the range of wild pollinator species necessary for ecological health and resiliency. Just to put it in numbers, there's about 300,000 species of flowering plants worldwide and 200,000 species of animal pollinators. So a major misconception about pollinator decline is that all species are declining at the same rate. In fact, many species are actually increasing in abundance and geographic distribution as a result of modern human land use and pesticide use. So seeing lots of bees does not necessarily mean that your project or your site is pollinator friendly. So this here is a long-tongued bumblebee forcing its way into a bottle gentian in order to obtain a very large nectar reward. And in doing so, the bee becomes covered with pollen as it sticks its head and tongue all the way down into the flower. This is an example of a specialized relationship. Bottle gentian can only be pollinated by bumblebees because bumblebees are the only pollinators that are large enough to force their way into the flower. And more than that, they can only be pollinated by long-tongued bumblebees because only long-tongued bumblebees have a long enough tongue to receive the nectar at the bottom of the flower, which is where the pollen is located. And so this type of relationship, if long-tongued bees were not on the landscape, bottle gentian would not be able to reproduce. And long-tongued bumblebees tend to be the bumblebees that are at the highest risk. Now, that's not the only type of bumblebee that's at risk. We've also faced a lot of population loss of Bombus affinis, which is a short-tongued bee. But in Massachusetts, we've got 2 long-tongued bee species which are at risk, which may be extirpated from the state within the next decade. And one of them was Bombus vagans, as we saw in that video. So currently, out of the approximately 11 commonly observed bumblebee species in Massachusetts, there are actually more than 11 bumblebee species on record, but some are extremely rare, like Bombus sandersoni. So looking at the 11 that have substantial records going back in the historical period to 1960, comparing to today in the last 20 or 30 years, you can see that 2 out of 11 species are already extirpated. They're not even found in the state, and that's Bombus affinis and Bombus pennsylvanicus. They were found historically in low numbers. Today, they're not found. And in the next decade, we're expected to lose Bombus fervidus and Bombus vagans if we don't really turn things around. And that's part of what we're trying to do with our work at Landscape Interactions in partnership with Dr. Robert Jagir at UMass Dartmouth, to whom this data is indebted. So seeing lots of bees is not necessarily a good thing. While some species are in decline or even no longer found in the state, others are more abundant now than historically. And this is common throughout the Northeast. This pattern of low elevation to high elevation is common in Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, all the way up to Maine and even New York State. So historically, in gold, you could see that in low elevation areas, which are areas in this particular map that are at 500 feet or less above sea level, so areas that are coastal or a low elevation, such as the Connecticut River Valley, areas around Boston and the coast up to the foothills of the Worcester Plateau, there were historically something like 7 or 8 or even maybe 9 bumblebee species found. About 6 or 7 of those were found in relatively high numbers. Today, it's really just Bombus impatiens And if you're lucky, you might come across a Bombus vermiculatus, gricicolis, or perplexus. In the rare occasion you find a Bombus ternarius, it's almost never happening. But on our sites where we're planting specifically for these at-risk species, we have been finding year after year species like Bombus fervidus, Bombus vagans, Bombus tricola, because we are attracting and sustaining them through plant selection and habitat modification. Looking at the high elevation areas, which represent in Massachusetts, places like the Worcester Plateau, the Berkshire Plateau, and the higher elevation hilltown areas of Franklin County and Hampshire County. In somewhere like Connecticut, that would basically be the northwest corner of Connecticut. You can see that historically there were 6 species that were relatively stable numbers and 3 were very high. Nowadays, it's mostly Bombus impatiens, Bombus gricicolis, with low numbers of vermiculatus, perplexus, vagans, ternarius, and borealis. So again, lots of bees is not necessarily a good thing. If you're just seeing Bombus impatiens on your site over and over again, most sites tend to have Bombus impatiens and honeybees. That is not an indication that this site is actually pollinator friendly. It is just simply supporting species whose numbers are at levels higher than they should be based on a healthy data set of what a diverse ecosystem is. And Mass Wildlife lists 5 more bee species and 44 butterfly and moths as species of greatest conservation needs. So we really need to look at those species at risk and design for them in our landscapes if we wish to save the creatures or stop biodiversity loss. You're not going to stop biodiversity loss, and you're not going to solve the climate crisis by attracting 2 or 3 species over and over to every site, which is currently what's going on. Diversity is resilience. Animal and plant species diversity is ecological resiliency, which is so crucial in today's time with so much weather and climate variability. The more diverse combination of plant and animal species in a landscape or in a community, that will increase the likelihood that the loss of one species can be somewhat compensated by other species that might play a similar role in the ecosystem, which is known as their niche. As I mentioned, 22% of New England's native plant taxa are either globally, regionally, or locally imperiled or extirpated. And in a study comparing the native flora of Concord, Massachusetts, from observations that were taken in the late 1800s and early 1900s by Henry David Thoreau and others, comparing to observations in the early 2000s, it was found that 27% of the species that had been recorded in the 18 to 1900s were no longer present, and a further 36% of formerly common species were now rare. And many of these species were just existing in a few numbers, or maybe even just one plant. This is really linked to the pollinator crisis, because if you look at other research that has come out last year, there was a study out of the University of New Hampshire that found that there's a 94% loss of plant pollinator networks across northern New England over the past 125 years. So in other words, we lose a plant, we lose a pollinator, and vice versa, 94%. They concluded, the researchers in this study, that conservation efforts should be focused specifically on habitat restoration for declining wild bee and plant species. What that means is we need to plant more rare plants. We need to plant rare plants to attract and sustain at-risk pollinators. We are not going to help the plants that are at risk. We are not going to help the pollinators that are at risk if we keep planting these common, abundant species. And that is my whole axe to grind with these state agencies and these plant conservation organizations like the Native Plant Trust or Mass Wildlife, for example, NHESP, in that they won't let people collect seeds from rare plant communities without going through all these loopholes, all these hurdles, jumping through all these hoops to get permits, to get permission. Where are you going to do this? Where are you going to introduce this? This diagram is the reason why we need to do this. Small isolated populations, whether it's animals, insects, which are animals, plants, everything from the Mexican gray wolf down to the smallest flower, they get caught in an extinction vortex if they are not within a community of genetic diversity for reproduction. In other words, you have an isolated group of animals, an isolated group of plants, whatever it is, it causes genetic inbreeding depression because there's low genetic variation, which means that the progenitors and the descendants over time become less fit to survive and adapt in the landscape. They become less tolerant to environmental and demographic changes, things like climate change. Then the habitat becomes lower quality, and eventually these species go infertile, and then they go extinct. So we need to restore gene flow into isolated populations. And this is not a perspective that is commonly held in the conservation world that we live in the Northeast. The idea of bringing in plants or seeds from another state, from another region, God forbid, in the name of saving these species before they go extinct, is appalling to many environmental professionals. But I encourage you all to consider what the alternative is. What these studies listed here at the bottom found, along with other studies, is that current concerns about outbreeding depression in populations that are recently fragmented. So in other words, populations of animals and plants that have been isolated or rare in a certain area, in a certain region for 500 years or less. That's their timeline for what's considered to be recent, the last 500 years. It's excessive. We are not going to mess them up, according to the science, by introducing new gene flow from a population in another area. This will help these species to survive and thrive. Essentially, it's letting the perfect get in the way of the good, is one way to think about it. If we try to only plant local ecotype to the state level, to the county level, to the bioregion, to the ecoregion, we are going to lose more species than ever before because you simply can't get the seeds and plants at a high enough number. And there have been great efforts to try to change this. There's the Ecotype project in Connecticut, which is doing great work, but let's be honest, they're only growing a couple dozen plants. We can't depend upon them for all of our plants for a state like Connecticut, and they don't sell them at large quantities. You can't buy ounces or pounds of seeds from these guys. So right here is a seed zone map. That is something that was created by the US Forest Service to indicate areas in the continental United States that are suitable for transferring seeds from one area to another and that the seeds would do well. So you can see here, it's an area in which plant materials can be transferred with little risk of being poorly adapted to their new location. Right here on the left, this is called the driftless area. It's a border area between Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, and Illinois. And it happens to have a flora and fauna that's more closely related to New England than those of the broader Midwest and Central Plains. This also happens to be the place where a lot of native plant nurseries are located, such as Prairie Moon and Prairie Nursery. Those guys have a lot of seeds and plants, and you can get them in bulk. Now we're going to compare the different seed transfer zones in this map. So first here on the left is Prairie Moon. As I mentioned, they're in Minnesota on the Wisconsin border, very far away from New England, but look at the color of their seed transfer zone. Right here is Ernst Seeds. They're in northwestern Pennsylvania, not too far from the border with Ohio and the Great Lakes. And then we have Wild Seed Project in Portland, Maine, one of the only Northeast-based seed companies that has a relatively decent availability of native plant seeds. Right here are 3 project sites of ours that I'm going to use as a comparison. So we have a site in Keene, New Hampshire, a site in Lincoln, Massachusetts, and a site in Leiden, Massachusetts. Now looking at Prairie Moon, they're in a seed transfer zone, which is described as 5 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit, 2 to 3 centimeters of rainfall. Same thing as Keene, New Hampshire, 5 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit, 2 to 3 centimeters of rainfall. Ernst is 15 to 20 degrees Fahrenheit, 2 to 3 centimeters rainfall. So you can see here that already the area that Ernst is located is a lot warmer, while its rainfall is similar to that of the driftless area and Keene, New Hampshire. Now, Ernst's seed transfer zone matches up really well with that of Lincoln. Unfortunately, Ernst didn't happen to have all the seeds we needed for our restoration projects in Lincoln, which I'll show you all in a bit, but it's worth mentioning that they are in the same seed transfer zone as Lincoln. And then Wild Seed Project in Portland, Maine, 10 to 15 degrees Fahrenheit, less than 2 centimeters of rainfall. And I'm comparing that to our site in Leiden, Massachusetts, in that the rainfall is the same, the temperature is a bit different. Leiden is 5 to 10 degrees. So Leiden is sort of halfway between Prairie Moon and Wild Seed Project as far as the seed transfer zone. The point is, just because you have a seed company located in Pennsylvania, which is technically part of the Northeast, although arguably Ernst is on the border with the Midwest anyway, or you have the Wild Seed Project in the heart of New England, it doesn't necessarily mean that these places have the same environmental conditions as your project site if you're in New England. Right here are some maps from a study that came out last year, which was published by the Mid-Atlantic Regional Seed Bank. It was looking at native plant materials use and commercial availability in the Eastern United States. You can see here, red is poor availability, blue is decent to good. So let's look at ecotype at the bottom. What is the availability of ecotype plants in the Northeast? If you're buying like, plugs or, potted plants, it's more poor than good, we can say. There's more red than blue. Whereas the availability of species, there's more better availability of species in general, just not of ecotype per se. Now let's compare seeds. Availability of seed species in the Northeast is let's say, okay. It's kind of half red, half blue. Now look at the availability of ecotype seeds in the Northeast. It's almost entirely red. So we really don't have a market set up to provide ecotype seeds or plants in the Eastern United States. So how can we hold our projects to that standard at the moment? True local ecotype native seeds and plants are difficult to obtain. You can't use rare plants from out of state if you're doing a habitat restoration project, which is subject to review by a state agency such as Mass Wildlife or Connecticut DEP. You can't collect rare plant seeds without a permit from such agencies. Permits are difficult to obtain. At-risk pollinators tend to favor at-risk or rare plants. And the question I ask you all is, do pollinators care where their seeds come from? Will a pollinator visit a flower, let's say Penstemon hirsutus, which is a rare plant in Massachusetts? Will they visit a Penstemon hirsutus if the seeds come from Minnesota? I assure you they will, because I've seen it myself year after year. And what are the consequences of current restoration strategies? If we continue to hold ourselves to this high standard of only using plants that are common, not rare, or of only using seeds and plants that are of local ecotype, we are going to enter into more extinction vortexes than ever before on the pollinator side and on the plant side. And I really think that this is what matters. Number one, don't plant pollinator habitat in areas that are contaminated by pesticides. Plant native plants. Cultivars, hybrids, and non-native plants largely do not support the pollen and nectar preferences of threatened pollinators, and they tend to favor common pollinator species whose populations are stable. Ensure that your plants come from a clean, pesticide-free source. Many commercial nurseries treat their plants and seeds. So those kinds of criteria, I think, are what we need to be focusing on, rather than, did those seeds come from the state that I live in? Or did you plant a rare plant with permission from, whatever agency is claiming to be the authority on the matter? I think we need to look beyond that and just look at restoring and redesigning our landscapes to promote biodiversity through natural ecosystems. So let's look at some case studies here. I've gone on a bit much about some of the background behind the work. Now I'll show you some of the work itself, and then look forward to hearing your questions and comments. The first project I'm going to show you is the Lincoln Pollinator Action Plan. This was a regional plan for the town of Lincoln that we created earlier this year. The entire project is based on scientific research that's being conducted by Dr. Robert Jagir at UMass Dartmouth. So before we made any plant recommendations or habitat restoration recommendations, Dr. Jagir surveyed our case study sites in Lincoln for the 2020 growing season in order to determine what were the at-risk pollinators that we were going to target in our design and restoration strategies. And he works a lot with citizen science groups, teaching them how to identify bumblebees and to upload the observations through the Beecology app, which is beecology.wpi.edu. What I think is so cool is the different ways that people get inspired by this and kind of take it to the next level. So here on the right are 3 screen grabs from a video that was created by Norm Levy, who's a resident of Lincoln, Massachusetts. He has been so inspired by the Pollinator Action Plan and Dr. Jagir's work that he created a video helping citizens in how to identify different bumblebee species by filming them in his town and then uploading sort of cues for what to look for. The way that we're looking at the sites in Lincoln and measuring whether or not they're successful is by comparing the before and after impacts of our designs. So in other words, what were the pollinator species that were on the site before we began, and what are those that arrived as a result? And right now we're in the midst of that research. We've got 2 more years of field observations before we come to our conclusions, but so far the project has been in the implementation stage. And since the plan was released, nearly 2,000 native plants were distributed in Lincoln to residential homeowners who planted the same plants that were recommended in the plan on their own sites. The Land Trust sold 98 planting kits. And right here on the top right is an image of students at the Burgess School in Lincoln installing plants on their landscape, which we designed. This here is a map of Lincoln. We've got our 4 case study sites in Lincoln where we're doing the 3-year surveys comparing the before and after impacts of the designs. And then in lighter purple, you have something like 60 sites across the town where residents of Lincoln that live in Lincoln planted the same plants on their sites. So putting a 500-foot buffer on those sites in yellow, which represents the average foraging range of a native bee, you can see all the opportunities for habitat connectivity just in this first phase in the project. Our baseline surveys were completed, as I mentioned, at the end of 2020. And what we found was for our 3 sites where we're doing the 3-year studies, one of them had a high abundance, a high diversity of native bumblebees and butterflies. One had a high abundance and a moderate diversity, and one had a low abundance and low diversity. So those are sort of indications of where the sites were at before we did anything. And here's the list of the at-risk pollinators that we targeted in our design and restoration approach. So we targeted 4 bumblebees and about 20 butterfly species. All of them are at risk in the state of Massachusetts. Here's our list of recommended plants, not just for Lincoln, but for northeastern Massachusetts as a whole, since the landscape conditions are pretty similar throughout the region. So you can see here we've got things like purple giant hyssop, big bluestem, little bluestem, swamp milkweed, butterfly weed, yellow wild indigo, native sedges, button bush, red bud, native thistles, lots of different Joe Pye weed, Dolingeria umbellata, spirea, different goldenrods, different asters, low bush and high bush blueberry, large and small cranberry. We've got hillside blueberry, we've got zizia, common blackberry, purple flowering raspberry, the list goes on. And all of this can be downloaded if you Google Lincoln Pollinator Action Plan. The idea is that we publish and make our work publicly available so that other people can replicate these designs and use these plant lists on their own site. So our 4 toolkit sites in Lincoln, these are the sites where we created unique habitat designs to be scaled and replicated across the town and throughout the region. They represented 4 different types of landscapes: a meadow and woodland, an old field, which was an abandoned sheep pasture. You can see here, this is a rendering of what the old field site, which is called Chapman Pasture, will look like after everything is installed and fully established. A wet meadow site and a garden and lawn site, which is the Burgess School. So for each site, we go through and we do a survey of existing conditions. We analyze the landscape in a number of different ways. We also survey the plant communities growing there. And then we come up with a design based on the target species that we're trying to attract. In this case, it was 4 bumblebee species: Bombus affinis, Bombus pennsylvanicus, Bombus vagans, and Bombus frivivus, and about 20 butterfly species. And this design represents the range of plants that we recommended be installed on the site in order to attract and sustain those species. For the Old Field site, which is Chapman pasture, you can see here at the bottom what it looked like. At the beginning, it was all non-native agricultural grasses. And we have examples of some of our landscape analyses for the site, existing conditions on the top left. Top right is slopes and drainage and movement of water across the site. And bottom right is hours of sun per day on average throughout the growing season. This here is our final design for the site. It's got 2 different seed mixes, a dry mix and a wet mix, and a number of different shrubs, trees, flowers, and native grasses and sedges. We also have management guidelines for each of our sites in the Lincoln plan, including site establishment and mowing regimes. And part of what we recommended with Lincoln was that they do a prescribed burn of the 8-acre field before they seed it because of the dominance of so many cool season non-native grasses. And in fact, we were lucky in finding a partnership with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and they supported the burning of the site this year in May. And here's the Chapman pasture site after the prescribed fire. You can see the firemen are on the site, making sure that the fire is not carrying over into unwanted areas. And I think that the current plan is to burn the site again next spring and then do a seeding the following fall. So what we found with Lincoln is that some of the sites are taking a little longer to establish than we anticipated. So we've had to hold off on doing some of the surveys. With Chapman pasture, for example, we're not surveying it until it's planted and seeded, obviously, because at this moment we've just done the burn, but already the site is shifting away from non-native grasses towards more flower-dominated and flower-rich landscape. This here was our wet meadow site. It was called Upper Browning Fields. And you can see here, we basically outlined the ecological communities on the site, including the dominant plant species, and then just basically came up with a change in the mowing schedule and a limited amount of plants that should be planted in key locations. So this is a pretty easy to implement example of a design. It's not really at the site-specific scale. And then here is the Birch's School design, the garden and lawn toolkit for Lincoln. And you can see at the bottom, we have what the site looked like before anything was installed, and then a rendering of what it would look like when everything is grown in. And on the bottom right, parents and students installing the design last fall of last year. So as part of our analysis for Lincoln, what we also did was we looked at what are the opportunities for replicability of the different toolkit sites. So on the right, on the left, you have the meadow and woodland site and the garden and lawn site, which essentially represent similar landscape conditions. And then all of the properties in Lincoln in yellow that have similar conditions. So these are all the properties that could have the meadow and woodland toolkit or the garden and lawn toolkit replicated on their own site. In the middle, you see towards the bottom right is the Chapman pasture site. And these are all the sites in Lincoln that would be suitable for application of that sort of a large scale grassland restoration. And on the right, here is the wet meadow site, Upper Browning Fields, and all of the sites in Lincoln in green that have similar ecological conditions to that wet meadow environment. And then we did a sort of synthesis and looked at all of the sites in Lincoln that were represented by one of the previous maps. So either they were suitable for 1, 2, or 3 of the toolkit replications, and they're within 500 feet of one of the existing sites that already has habitat installed. So you can see here, these would be our first priority sites for replication. And here they are with a 500-foot buffer on them, offering a potential corridor through the town. And here are some pictures of the implementation of the Pollinator Action Plan in Lincoln. Different sites across the town where people are installing either the exact designs we created or mimicking those designs on their own properties. Pollinate Northampton is another project I did, which might be of interest. it looked at replicable and scalable landscape designs that were not based on specific sites, but rather common scenarios that you would find in a city or town center in a place like central or western Massachusetts. So we basically created 5 schematic designs that are not actually based on a real location, but they just represent something that could be mimicked. So we had a sun garden, 1,000 square feet, and then the plant list associated with it. We had a sidewalk strip, so a planting space between the sidewalk and a road, approximately 50 feet long, and a plant schedule for that. We did a bee and butterfly lawn design, so how to convert an existing lawn into habitat without actually removing all of the grass, maybe just removing some of it. And guidelines for how to create a bee nesting habitat is something that we include in all of our designs. And if this is of interest, you can also download this online. If you go to landscapeinteractions.com/services, we've got the download links for the Lincoln Pollinator Action Plan and the Pollinate Northampton toolkits. McKean Farm, Meadows and Hedgerows is a project we did in Ridgefield, Connecticut last year, where we took a large conservation property that was owned and managed by the Conservation Commission of Ridgefield and created a biodiverse design for at-risk pollinators. These were our 4 design areas. We did a hedgerow, we did an upper, lower meadow, and a wet meadow. And this site can be visited pretty easily if you drive in Ridgefield on Old Stagecoach Road. You can see the parking areas on the top of the map. Just pull in and follow the mode path. With all of our projects, we sort of take a different spin. So this site, we talked a bit about the history of the site and our work with the Norwalk River Watershed Association and the Ridgefield Conservation Commission to collaborate on the design for the site. And you can see here in the middle is what the hedgerow looked like before anything was done. It was filled with invasives, bittersweet, barberry, multiflora rose. And then after the Conservation Commission and all of their volunteers did all of the invasive species removal, this is what it looked like before planting on the right. And this was all done by Eagle Scouts in Ridgefield. As I mentioned, science informs the design on most of our projects. And so here is just an example of how we look at bumblebee species diversity and distribution across a place like Connecticut and how it informs our design and the species that we target. And this is the list of species that we targeted for the McKean Farm project with the Ridgefield Conservation Commission. And here's an example of what the design looked like. So you have the hedgerow at the top, species like redbud, American holly, scrub oak, shining willow and meadow willow, northern bush honeysuckle understory, shrubby St. John's wort, Carolina rose, Virginia rose, Rubus odoratus, Spirea alba, Spirea tomentosa, lowbush blueberry, and then, Carex pennsylvanica as a shade-tolerant understory to that. We had a number of different species in the meadow mix. We had purple Joe pieweed, New York aster, and tall white aster also in the hedgerow, and then willows and northern bush honeysuckle planted in other hedgerows to the south and to the west of the meadow areas. And this here is a cross section of what the design looks like from the ground. So you see there's a 8-foot wide mowed path in between the meadow and the hedgerow. The hedgerow has an old stone wall. We recommended planting some smaller pollinator supporting trees and shrubs there as a transition to the meadow area. Here's some of our best management practices that we also include in most of our projects. And this is something that you can find in the various plans that I've shared today. And we also provided meadow establishment and maintenance guidelines. So how to actually create the meadows out of the existing landscape conditions, whether smothering or seed drilling or raking and drilling or what have you. The Green Corridor Pollinator Toolkit is a project we did in collaboration with the Aspetuck Land Trust in Westport. And it looked at 5 different types of designs on a site that's 16 acres, which is called the Haskins Preserve, open to the public, a garden design, a lawn, a meadow, a woodland, and a wetland. Again, we kind of just give different sort of context and descriptions to each of our plans. This is sort of how the project starts in the Haskins Preserve. This is the design overview. We have an entry understory which is mostly shade-tolerant species between the parking lot and the sun and shade garden, which is zone number 2, located in an old courtyard, a pretty dry area. We've got the bee and butterfly lawn to the right of that, transitioning to a woodland edge area, a meadow, and a pond and stream crossing, which is essentially a wetland replication area. And here's a rendering of what the courtyard will look like in a few years, hopefully. We were able to install the courtyard design at Haskins this spring, and it went really well. We put something like 6,000 plants in the ground there in 2 days with a number of volunteers that the Land Trust was able to get to show up, including high school students, local farmers, landscape companies, lending their crew, and local neighbors and members of the community. We also provided guidelines in the Green Corridor Toolkit through the Aspetuck Land Trust for how to turn your lawn into habitat. So you can look that up if you Google Haskins Preserve Green Corridor Toolkit. You can download this online as well, or just email me, evan@landscapeinteractions.com. And I'll just go really briefly through this section. This is more agricultural based, but these here are some shots of the landscape that I own and steward in Leiden, Massachusetts. We've got a 9-acre field, old field, former pasture and farmland that is surrounded by 60 forested acres. And I've been engaged in a study for the past 2 years looking at the impacts of rotational livestock grazing on native plant diversity on the site. So we burned the field through a collaboration with U.S. Fish and Wildlife this past spring. And you can see here that the burn went really well. We were able to really reduce the cool season grasses almost completely from the site. And this is what it looked like in September after the communities grew back in. You could see there was lots of little blue stem, Indian grass, goldenrods, and asters. And now I'm currently in the process of brush hogging the site, raking it and seeding it. And unfortunately, as I mentioned at the beginning of the call, I just put some serious damage into my tractor this morning. So hopefully I'll wrap things up before it snows. So with the study that we did, so far we've collected 1 growing season of data. We've looked at the entire field, which is outlined in the dashed areas. They're just different colors to represent the different types of conditions, whether it's full sun, part shade, more native, more non-native, a little wet. And then we have here, these color block areas are the areas where the animals were grazing. So they move through each color block over a period of 1 week on a 6-week rotation. So they were in the green area for 1 week, then pink, orange, etc. And so here's all the areas where we sampled vegetation. What we found just in this 1 growing season is that with the right timing and intensity, rotational grazing and native flowering diversity is possible in the same field. You can actually feed livestock and pollinators simultaneously. So here's a list of some of the native species that are supported. In other words, you can graze, these species will exist in the field, the livestock will eat around them or only lightly graze them and still allow them to flower and set seed. So the implications are pretty wide as far as what you could do with such a project. You know, you could literally be raising livestock in native grassland habitat. You don't have to put livestock just in these agricultural traditional pastures. You know, they actually can find things to eat, especially in an old field where you have a pretty even mix of native and non-native. And we're going to be collecting more data after we do the direct seeding and things fully established over the next 2 years. So how do we measure the success of our sites? You know, as I mentioned, we try to monitor and compare pollinator species diversity on the site before and after the landscapes are modified through our designs and through our plants. So we compare native bumblebee species. We usually use bumblebees as a metric of success or failure. We're also adding usually now butterflies, and we may start to add more non-bumbus bees, specialist bees, and moths in the future. The problem with that is that there's not a lot of data out there regarding which non-bumbus are at risk and especially with moths, which moths are at risk, because you really need to have better historical data to compare it to see what's going on. But as we are able to obtain this data, we incorporate it and we target these species. And we do 3-year study periods showing the before and after impacts. I encourage you all to download the Beecology app. You can get it at beecology.wpi.edu. Basically, you upload a video on your smartphone or tablet, and the app helps you, it takes you through a series of prompts to help you identify the bumblebee at the species level, whether it's male or female, and then you upload it, and Dr. Jagir and his team at UMass Dartmouth will verify the observations. So unlike iNaturalist, it's being verified by a human at the species level. And a human who is well-trained in bumblebee identification. Here's a map of some of the observations in the Northeast from the Beecology app, and we would like to get more observations, so please download it and use it. And we are using it on our sites as well to help community members observe bees on those sites. And this here is our website, landscapeinteractions.com. You can reach me here if you have any questions that we're not able to address during today's Q&A. And I look forward to hearing from you all now. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Evan, for sharing your research and projects with us today, and for making this information available to the public on your website. I've had the opportunity to explore and read through these reports, and hope that those of you who are watching us today or joining us today will explore his detailed studies and designs and plant lists for more information. There was so much covered here today, and I know on my screen some of it was a little small, but we are recording this presentation, so you all will get a link to view this again if you want. And as Evan said, much of this information is available on his website. We have a few minutes for questions, and there are several in the chat. I'll start at the beginning. Evan, your statement about invasive species being responsible for a certain percentage of extinctions, are you referring to invasive animals like brown tree snakes and invasive diseases like Dutch elm disease? While they admittedly have serious adverse impacts, I'm not aware of invasive plants causing extinctions. Could you tell us a little bit more about that, or correct Russ if he's wrong about that?
Yeah, I apologize. I had to get up for a second. My puppy was wanting to go out, or thought, yeah, I think he did go out. I'm going to go back to that slide. So the question was with regards to the invasive species statement. The statement is from a study, and it found that I believe 40% of all known animal extinctions globally were caused by invasive species. So it's a mix of everything. It's invasive plants, invasive animals. You know, one example is, you know, these feral hogs that are in places like New Zealand or Hawaii. They're responsible for several different species collapses. These invasive, you know, rodents that show up on these Pacific islands and how they impact avians and other, even sometimes plant communities. So that's what that is referring to. And I did try to preface that by saying, you know, this is looking at globally. This is including things like island communities. So certainly in the Northeast or in the United States as a whole, we do not have such a high level of, you know, of extinctions from invasive species. But I like to, you know, give the global perspective and then dial it into the local. So it comes from this, this report, which is listed here at the bottom, IPBES 2019, that's the UN, Global Assessment Report on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services of the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And you can get it here, and it included that statement.
Russ, it looks like you've unmuted yourself. Did you want to follow up to that question?
Can't. So
Okay, he's muted himself back up. Okay, next question for you, simple yes or no, it looks like, or maybe not, but we'll see. Do you know the California-based organization Wild Farms Alliance? And if so, what do you think of it?
I don't know them.
All right, we'll have to put that on your list for the future.
Yeah, just follow up with me over email if you want to talk about something specific like that.
Super. Anna asks, I have a large area, mixed woodlands and old horse pasture, and would like to plant natives. Is there a list of rare plants and at-risk insects for Connecticut?
Yeah, I shared 2 projects today from Connecticut.
And so your rare plant lists are available through those project studies?
I do want to clarify, not all of our designs include only rare plants. I would say maybe like 20% maximum. It might even be less. Like we're just planting what we know at-risk pollinators prefer. So yeah, there's a couple of rare plants in there, but it's not like the whole thing is rare. I mean, we've got a lot of common species as well. Anyhow, yeah, so the answer to that would be download or Google. I'll put the link into the chat. How's that? I will get the link for the downloads for the 2 Connecticut plants.
That'd be great, thank you.
Let me just get out of full screen here. And I can keep taking questions though. I'll just do this while I'm listening.
Sure. Kind of a follow-up to this then, you mentioned that you know, the rare plants are in your gardens and landscape designs, maybe not all over the landscape. So this question might be especially relevant. Do you know how pollinators find the rare plants in the landscapes?
Do I know how they find them?
Yeah, like if there's a rare plant that you've planted in a landscape, how do the pollinators find them?
Pollinators find plants in different ways. With the example of a bee, they go to what's in bloom. So if a plant is in bloom, they will visit it if they are evolved to prefer it or need it. The way that it seems like maybe the question is asking, how do we know that these plants are visited by these pollinators? I'm sort of gonna maybe take a step towards that in my answer. And the answer to that is, when a plant is in bloom, you can observe it in the field and you can see which species are pollinating it by watching the flowers. And so it's pretty easy to survey a landscape during the growing season for at-risk pollinators or any pollinators, because you simply just hang out where the blooming flowers are with bees. With butterflies, they'll also be going to flowers for nectar. That won't tell you about host plants or host plant preferences, but butterfly host plant preferences are pretty well documented. You can get a lot of that information through research already. With bees, Dr. Jagir's research is very new in that he's really at the species level, looking at the different plants that different bumblebees visit over and over, like year after year on different sites. And so he's correlating a plant species with a bumblebee species with repeated visitation, not just once. So he doesn't include it in the list of this is like a Bombus vagans pollen plant, for example, unless he's observed it like sustained observations over multiple years, over multiple sites. And so that's how we gather the data. Believe it or not, very few, if any, of the thousands of scientists out there that study pollinators have studied the behavior of pollinators with regards to plants. Very few have studied which pollinators visit which flowers and like actually created those associations like Dr. Jagir is doing. It seems like, especially if you're speaking to a plant audience, as I feel like, you know, a lot of the people in the audience today might be very plant focused or very passionate about gardening or plants. To us, it would seem like obvious, you know, why wouldn't you want to know what plants are being visited by which pollinators, if you're a pollination ecologist. A lot of pollination ecologists or bee scientists, they set up traps. Then they return to the site and they gather the traps. The traps have the dead insects in them, and then they identify them in the lab. And then that's called knowing what's on the site. But that doesn't tell you anything about what those animals are doing. When you catch them, even if you have the trap like on a tree or on a bush that was flowering the week before, it doesn't mean that they were pollinating that plant. They could have just been flying by. They could have been visiting it for nectar or for pollen or both. And the same thing goes with nesting preferences. It's also really understudied. Most people are just now starting to try to figure out, where does Bombus fervidus nest? Like, what kind of a landscape do they need to like build a nest? You know, these kinds of observations. And so Dr. Jagir is actually, you know, years ahead of the mainstream scientific community in the fact that he's been looking at this for at least 6 years, looking at repeated visitations of certain plants by certain pollinators and comparing historical records of which pollinators are in decline. So in other words, what pollinators today are in much lower numbers across the region than they were historically. That's called decline. Comparing history to the current time period. And the current period is considered to be, depending upon who you're talking to, it could be like anywhere from 2000 to now, or it could be from like the 90s until now. That's sort of like the period where things started to change, was in the 90s, when a lot more pesticides started to come into the market and land use development started to accelerate.
Great, thank you. A very thorough answer to what seemed like a very simple question. But yeah, it's so complex, and without that documentation, it's hard for us really to know. Another question for you. Let's see. This one a little bit more detailed. Someone just asked, and thank you for the great information you're sharing. I'm currently, this is Jamie, it looks like, sorry, Jamie is currently working with the Norwalk River Watershed Association as an AmeriCorps volunteer and working at the McKinnon Farm and the Hickories. So Jamie's heard a lot about your work. Jamie would like to know more about why the Ecotype project isn't ideal. We understand that the goal was to use the Ecotype as a way to establish better long-term biodiversity because the plants will be adapted to the specific environment. By using plants from the seed transfer zone, does this ensure that adaptation is possible?
Well, you know, there's kind of two answers to that I would like to provide. One, regarding the first question, the Ecotype project is great. And for the Haskins Preserve in Westport, by the way, I put into the chat the links for the 2 Connecticut projects so that those who were interested in a list of plants and pollinators to target for Connecticut could have that information available. We got all of the plants from the Ecotype project that were available for the plants that were on our list. So we bought, like, you know, hundreds. Excuse me one second, just gonna close the door here. We bought hundreds of plants, if not thousands, from the Ecotype project for our design in Westport, just because the timing was right. But that design has like 70 plants on it. And the Ecotype project only has like maybe like 30 or 20. And a lot of the plants that they have are not plants that we recommend because they don't support the list of at-risk species that we're targeting for that site. So, you know, just because it's native doesn't mean it's going to be used by, you know, a bumblebee that's at risk or a butterfly that's at risk. Someone asked about, you know, mountain mint. I love mountain mint. It's got a lot of associations with moths nectaring. Certainly butterflies visit it. Lots of bees visit it for nectar. not associated with any of the at-risk bumblebees or butterflies specifically, but I know that it also supports wasps, which is great for farmscapes, like if you're trying to have beneficial insects for, reducing crop pests. So, there's reasons to plant it. I have some of it planted outside my office, but it hasn't been on any of the project sites so far. Regarding the second question, so with the Ecotype project, it's just a limitation. They just don't have everything we need. We have to get plants from elsewhere. No one has everything we need. Now, the other thing is that also it's a question of scale. At the Haskins Preserve, where the individual who asked the question is volunteering, we installed something like 1 or 2 acres of direct seed for a meadow. You can't buy direct seeds from the Ecotype project. They might sell seed packets, but they don't sell them by the pound, which is what's needed if you're restoring 1 or 2 acres. So we had to get our seeds from Prairie Moon. Now, interestingly enough, the second question, will these plants from the seed transfer zones survive or do well? I will let you know the following. A lot of native plant nurseries, including Wild Seed Project, they collect seeds and sell them from garden collection and from wild collection. My understanding from speaking to one of the founders of the Wild Seed Project is something like 1/3 of their seeds come from gardens. Now, a lot of people in the Northeast that have gardens have gotten seeds from the Midwest back in the day, whether it was 3 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. I mean, everyone I know who I've talked to who grows plants, who gardens, everyone's got a little bit of Prairie Moon stock growing on their landscape. So these plants, not only are they doing fine coming from out in the driftless area of the Midwest, we're actually, in some cases, buying them thinking that they were collected in the Northeast from these pristine native wild populations. But it's not the case. It's just not like that. It's just really hard to get the seeds. We have very fragmented plant communities in the Northeast. It's a very small area geographically. There's a lot of development. A lot's been destroyed. What has not been destroyed is oftentimes not allowed to be collected on. And people are getting seeds where they can get them. I've got all kinds of plants at our sites, at my site where I live, at sites that we've installed for our clients, with seeds from the Wild Seed Project, with seeds and plants from Prairie Moon, and from the Ecotype Project, and from Ernst, and from other nurseries across the region. And they're all equally growing and being visited by pollinators. Pollinators do not have preferences based on where the plant was harvested from. Their preferences are at the species level. It's a genetic preference. It's not a preference, it's not a geographic preference, it's a genetic preference.
Evan, that's great news to hear. I think a lot of us have been thinking about this, especially with information from the Ecotype project. Here at the Connecticut College Arboretum, we've been growing native plants since 1931, and our formal record keeping for where those plants have come from didn't start until the 1990s. So what you're saying rings definitely true with what we're experiencing and what we're seeing in our landscape. Just to put a little plug in for the Arboretum, one of my favorite classes to lead here, one of my favorite workshops is our seed collecting workshop, which we usually will offer in the fall and look forward to offering again next year, where we collect everything from woody plants down to perennials and wildflowers. And so hopefully those of you who are interested in obtaining more native seeds and planting more biodiverse landscapes, you can join us. We are coming to the end of our time here today. I would like to thank Evan and ask everyone else here to thank Evan as well, or thank everyone, or on behalf of everyone else, thank you, Evan, so much for your presentation today. I'd also like to thank the Connecticut Mountain Laurel chapter of Wild Ones for co-sponsoring this program, and encourage all of you to join their organization to receive emails and check out their Facebook page for information about their free monthly programs that include lectures, workshops, and field trips, many of them that take place here at the Arboretum and collaboration with our public programs. For everyone here at the Arboretum, we thank you all for joining the Smaller American Lawns Today movement. We encourage you to explore your interest in native plants, doing what you can to make positive changes in our environment, and sharing all of this information that you've learned during this series with your friends and neighbors. Thank you all so much, and we look forward to seeing you in the Arboretum and online if that needs to be the case in the near future. Thank you all so much, and thank you again, Evan. This was really informative and inspiring.
Thanks, Maggie. I appreciated the invite. I hope it was worthwhile for you guys. I know it was a long presentation, but yeah, you can, I'll put my email in the chat, and if anyone has like a kind of a, I guess, a more specific question that wasn't addressed, you can follow up with me. I can't make recommendations for what people should do with their, with their project or their garden or their site without visiting it. So that's really hard to do over the internet, but we do site visits when it's the right fit. So you can ask me about that. And yeah, I encourage you all, whether you're based in Connecticut or elsewhere, to check out our projects. Head down to the Haskins Preserve in Westport the next time you're down there. You'll see the courtyard installation. The rest of it is being installed next year, but it's a pretty big area that we did. You could head over to Ridgefield and look at McKean Farm. It's on Old Stagecoach Road. And yeah, I put the plans in the chat. So hopefully that answers some more questions.
Super, and I'll send these out to everyone with the link for today's presentation.
Okay, well, take
Thanks,
care, everyone.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.